Dear participants, welcome to the 10th Belgrade Security Forum. Our next panel is starting now.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us here at the Belgrade Security Forum. Alas, we are online this year. I'm joining from Washington, D.C., which is today quite miserable and gray. I looked at the weather forecast in Belgrade, and it looks much more pleasant. I speak for all of my colleagues here on this panel, I think, when I say I wish we could all be together with you in Belgrade right now. Maybe to drink some coffee after the session, or maybe even some rakia. Our panel today is an excellent one. The subject is the world after the U.S. elections, which is admittedly really a huge topic. And we have Contantine Arvanitopoulos, who's the professor of Hellenic and European Studies at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. Karen, let me turn to you first. Like most people in the DC policy world, at this point in any election cycle, but perhaps more so than ever in this particular election cycle, we're all trying to figure out what American policy looks like in the next 4 years. Maybe you could kick our discussion off by walking us through some of your recent work on this, some of your thinking. And, very broadly, what would it look like? What would American foreign policy look like under President Biden? And, given that you never know with elections, no matter what the polls tell you, what would it look like under a second term of President Trump?
Well, thanks so much. And I do second your sentiment that it would be wonderful if we were all in Belgrade. And a shout out to all of my friends in Belgrade. It's wonderful to be participating again in the Belgrade Security Forum. And Damir, I think you're right to say that we don't actually know what's going to happen on November 3rd. My crystal ball is a little bit cloudy, so we should be thinking about what U.S. foreign policy looks like under either administration. And as I think about what the next chapter of transatlantic relations look like, I reflect on both of these two individuals, Donald Trump and Joe Biden, and what we've seen to date. If Donald Trump is reelected, we can safely assume that he will double down on the policies he has pursued in his first term. Supporters of President Trump who support his America First policy share his view that the United States has long been taken advantage of by its European allies. Many Europeans, disillusioned with U.S. leadership, desire greater military, technological, and economic autonomy. Under this scenario, it is hard to see transatlantic relations becoming less complicated going forward. Alliance is not something enduring as President Trump sees it, but rather it's a series of transactions. If Joe Biden were to win the US election, he has said that one of the first things he would do as president would be to get on the phone with other heads of state and say, America's back. You can count on us. He has pledged to immediately rejoin the Paris Climate Accord, the World Health Organization, and other UN bodies. He has said he would plan to return to the Iran nuclear deal if Tehran also returns to compliance. Those moves would be applauded by most of our European partners. Essentially, he seeks to return the United States to this tradition of liberal multilateralism. And the system of alliances would be at the core of that. So, noting the significant differences between a second Trump and a Biden administration, I have been co-chairing a GMF Bundeskanzler Helmut Schmidt Stiftung task force together with Wolfgang Ischinger, the chair of the Munich Security Conference, that looked at 6 critical issues facing each side of the Atlantic: pandemics, economic recovery, climate, China, technology, and security. And we concluded that both sides of the Atlantic will be best poised to meet those challenges if we pursue common transatlantic action. And in that spirit, we offered 36 concrete policy recommendations for either administration. So while accepting there are important policy differences, we think there are overriding concerns that might encourage us under either scenario to try to foster transatlantic cooperation. So we understand that some of the initiatives we propose will lack bipartisan support. Some will not be embraced by one or the other administration, nor are all of these recommendations going to appeal to every European. But the problems we face are shared and the challenge is real. So let me just take one example that's illustrative. If you take the issue of technology, Europe and the United States have long been technological rivals, but we are also partners. The competitive dynamics around technology are shifting. China has become a major player in the global tech game. Neither Americans nor Europeans have the resources to prevail against such competition on our own. And to give a concrete example, PricewaterhouseCoopers recently estimated that artificial intelligence could increase global GDP by 15.7 trillion by 2030. And they further showed that a disproportionate share of those gains, about 7 trillion, will be captured by China. Studies like that should concentrate our minds. So one of our recommendations would be to provide greater financial and regulatory incentives for transatlantic science and technology partnerships, including pre-competitive cooperation on research and development for emerging technologies. Whomever wins the US presidential election, Americans and Europeans need to demonstrate that transatlantic cooperation can offer effective solutions to our most vexing challenges. So I think that's the mandate for either administration. Thanks.
I think this is an excellent place to pivot and ask Ivana to chime in on this. Ivana, it is one of the questions, one of the refrains that comes up over the last 4 years. It's that Trump has wrecked the liberal international order by basically ignoring multilateral institutions, and of which, again, there's many ways to discuss what the liberal world order is, but multilateralism is a very important part of it. So do you see that a Biden administration would entail a kind of reset to this?
Thank you, Damir, and Belgrade Security Forum organizers for inviting me, and it is my pleasure to speak with you today. So, to answer your question, yes, the Trump administration has been employing the America First approach, not only to American domestic politics, but also to international relations. So the Trump administration, for example, withdrew from numerous international agreements and international organizations, just to name a few of them: the Paris Climate Accord, the World Health Organization, the International Open Skies Treaties, the Iran nuclear deal, the United Nations Human Rights Council. So President Trump has criticized and questioned organizations such as also NATO and the group of semi-leading nations. But we also know that the Trump administration plans to withdraw troops from Europe. But before I answer your question on how Biden might actually approach multilateralism, I have to first and foremost talk about the fact that first we need to understand that multilateralism itself is also in deep crisis, that has started even before the Trump administration. For example, in 2 days, the United Nations is celebrating its 75th anniversary. And more than 7 decades ago, the organization had admirable goals of preventing future world conflicts, uphold human rights, and promote social progress. While it has achieved a lot of its goals, what we see nowadays is that a rising China and a revanchist Russia have recently been using the United Nations to promote their own interests, shaping the United Nations values and rules, sometimes really to the point of absurdity. For example, during the coronavirus pandemic, the World Health Organization publicly praised China for its transparency. Despite being the leading countries responsible for human rights violations, China and Russia have both just been elected to the United Nations Human Rights Council. So the United Nations is actually one of many theaters in which the Trump administration's isolationism has allowed Russia and China to expand their influence in international politics. For example, China right now leads 4 out of 15 United Nations agencies. So Trump's withdrawal from all those agencies have left authoritarian regimes to run the show. His decision to leave multilateralism is really dangerous because the only way that you can have a control is of those institutions is if you are inside. So the United States must be back in the game, but the question is really whether it will be. So one just needs to, for example, see how China is lobbying with the United Nations for countries to vote in particular way, or Russia that is nowadays setting standards to regulate international cyberspace really raises the new question of the future of multilateralism. So Joe Biden promised a new era of international cooperation. He promised to recommit the United States to global alliances and international accords that Trump has either quit or criticized. So to begin with, he really wants to be maybe anti-Trump. But should Biden win, he could move to reverse some Trump's plans to leave the World Health Organization by next summer. In theory, he also pledged to join Paris Accords. He also said that regarding Iran nuclear deal, he said that he would seek to return to a deal to curb Iran's nuclear ambitions. The question is also about the United Nations Human Rights Council. For example, as I mentioned last week, China, Russia, Pakistan were all elected. So this institution needs a reform, and the United States is not even a party of the United Nations Security Council. But Biden, for example, plans to rejoin, but without even a new reform. And without a new reform, the council is really doomed to fail. So to protect, let's put it this way, to protect freedom across the world and to remain relevant, the United Nations is first and foremost in desperate need of reform. So whoever wins in November, one thing must happen. The United States should build better alliances with European countries within the United Nations and with its allies from Asia to push for new reforms. And the United States must create a new strategy for the United Nations and not to allow Russia and China to reform the world.
Thank you, Ivana. That's actually terrific. I think we're starting to hit our stride here. Constantine, let me direct you a couple of things that have come up in here. I think the role of China is emerging, I think, in all of the remarks as a unifying thing. I would say one of the lasting, one could say, strategies or sound bites, depending on how charitable you're feeling about it, of the Trump presidency has been this, that we have now entered an era of great power competition. So on the one hand, there's the question of China, and maybe you could talk a little bit about, how you see changes perhaps in the Biden administration, the approach to China and what the role of China might be. But I'd also like you to maybe reflect on something that I think has come out from what both Ivana and Karen have said, which is the question of leadership and U.S. leadership. And maybe you could strike a balance on talking about that, because it strikes me that what is important in any kind of world order and is the question of America's role and how America leads. Now, Biden has been both ways, but maybe you can talk a little bit about that, about how you see America's role developing going ahead.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the kind invitation. And it's an honor to be in such a great panel with such a great company. And let me start by saying that we in Europe, I consider myself a European, we have to be realistic about the systemic changes that are happening. There is a declining interest in Europe on the part of the United States, and that has come as a result of the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the fact that the Soviet Union has been succeeded by a declining Russia, and also the rise of China on the other hand. Now, these developments have, if you combine those developments with trends in demographics, the fact that European immigration to the United States is declining, and the role of the Europeanists in the U.S. foreign policy establishment is also declining. If you look at the American universities, you will see that there is a declining interest in European studies. So you see that there is a decline in Europe, in the interest, in the U.S. interest in Europe. But to be fair to the Trump administration, the so-called pivot to Asia preceded the Trump administration. I mean, it was a policy that was created by the Obama-Biden administration, and most probably will not be reversed by a Biden administration. And, you know, the truth of the matter is that since George W. Bush, all American presidents have followed the policy of quote-unquote disengagement, partial disengagement from Europe, that differs only in scope and style. And I would add to that, for the benefit of our viewers, that concern with Asia is not a new element in U.S. foreign policy. There has always been a strong tradition of U.S. involvement in Asia that dates all the way back to Andrew Jackson and Theodore Roosevelt. I mean, for those that the history buffs, Theodore Roosevelt was the first American president to be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1906. His back-channel efforts to broker the Treaty of Portsmouth that ended the Russo-Japanese War. So, you know, there is a sense of continuity, and I do believe that there will be a sense of continuity with the new focal point of the U.S. foreign policy being in Asia rather than in Europe. Whether we have a second Trump administration or a Biden administration. Now, what will change though? The U.S.-China feud under the Trump administration was mainly on trade issues. I mean, the withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Agreement was had to do with Trump's aversion with multilateral policies and alliances in general, but also was a result of his fixation that every transaction should be a zero-sum game with a clear winner and a clear loser. And he was very keen in striking his own bilateral trade deal with China and sell it to his electorate in his own glowing terms. And it was only after the pandemic hit the United States that Trump's rhetoric towards China became bellicose. Now that the China virus, as Trump called it, started threatening his presidency, the rhetoric of his administration, if you remember Pompeo's terms, was shifted to value, and it was pitting the free world against tyranny. Now, this is an element of change that I believe will happen if we have a democratic administration, in the sense that a democratic administration is more likely to bring values and human rights at the center of its foreign policy towards China. Now, having said that, I want to link that with transatlantic relations and say that the China's increased economic and political footprint in Europe has led to growing concerns, not only in the United States, but also in the European Union. The absence of a unified European policy approach gave China increased leverage on a bilateral basis with many EU member states. And that resulted to a new Commission document, the EUChina Strategic Outlook, that finally stated that China is an economic competitor in the pursuit of technological leadership and a systemic rival. So for the very first time, the European Union came to delimit its and form its relationship with China and try to streamline the approach of all the EU member states vis-a-vis China. So what we have now is that we have security concerns on the part of the European Union with respect to technology, its technology base, its 5G networks, China's role in connecting billions of sensitive information and communication technology systems in crucial sectors that has become of concern, not only in the United States, but also in Europe. And if you add to that the issue of values and the issue of democracy, the issue of human rights, you have the basic elements that can lead to a common transatlantic approach vis-a-vis China. And I say that, and I will end my response to the China issue with one caveat. I do think that the policy of the U.S. policy of pivoting to Asia does have an internal flaw because it does try to give a regional answer to a global challenge. The China challenge, it's not only in Asia, it's not only in Southeast Asia. Through BRI, through the Belt and Road Initiative, China poses a challenge in Africa, in the Middle East, in the source of Europe. So at the same time that the US is pivoting to Asia, China is pivoting to Europe. So to go back to the old geopolitical term of Eurasia, I think both Europe and the United States should pivot to Eurasia to face the Chinese challenge. And I think we have the elements here of a potential common policy between the two sides of the Atlantic vis-a-vis the global rise of China. Now, a short comment with respect to leadership, that if I may.
Sure.
I do believe that leadership is very important for all the reasons that Karen Donfried stressed. That it is important. Rhetoric is important. Alliances are important. It is a matter of concern for Europeans that this offensive rhetoric. I mean, the Europeans understand that there is a declining interest on the part of the United States in Europe, but we can, and we have gone from a condition of, for example, European dependence on the American defense umbrella, to a debate in Europe for a potential European strategic autonomy. And this is an outcome of bad leadership on the part of the United States. I think with another tenant in the White House, it would be easier to talk about a common ground of strategic complementarity. So I think leadership matters. Leadership matters in the way it frames the issues, in the way the rhetoric that uses with allies and friends and enemies. I mean, it's been very unnerving to hear Trump characterizing Europe as a foe. I mean, this is the first time in history, while at the same time almost characterizing Russia as a friend. So these things matter. So leadership does matter, and especially in transatlantic relations.
Thank you so much, Constantine. That was terrific. Karen, I'd love to hear you react to that a little bit. And let me just throw out a couple of thoughts for you, because I think there's many ways to approach this. Again, on leadership, clearly and it sounds like your research has found that there are areas of cooperation that should work. But at the same time, a lot of these issues, as Constantine mentioned, and I think it's another sort of question that keeps going around, they've been around for a while in the transatlantic relationship specifically, that there has been drift. There was drift under Obama, and this is not to overstate the continuity between Obama and Trump, that the rhetoric matters, and leadership is rhetoric, and all sorts of things like that. At the same time, do you think that all we need is or let me put it a different way. Do you think that the Biden administration has a coherent agenda of leading on specific issues in the transatlantic sphere, where it can show leadership and bring the allies along, rather than the sort of stated thing right now to say we're back and let's figure out where we can cooperate? Is there a real agenda there underneath there that they just haven't yet unfolded?
Well, there's a lot that's on the table here. And I think part of the question is what you just articulated, which is the US interested in engaging with Europe on these issues? The other part of the equation is, do the Europeans want to engage with the US on these issues? And we have to look at both parts of that equation. And I think that what's changed for Europeans over the past 4 years is, while you're right, many of these issues have been on the table for a long time, the Europeans have sensed that there are not just policy differences between the United States and Europe in 2020, but there are deeper differences in how we want to engage in the world. And I think Ivana's presentation on multilateralism was really compelling, because Europeans see the multilateral system as existential for them. And as they have watched, as Ivana talked us through, President Trump essentially take a wrecking ball, whether it's calling the EU a foe, as Constantine mentioned, or withdrawing from the World Trade Organization, the Paris Climate Accord, the World Health Organization. That vacuum, of course, has been filled not by Europeans, but primarily by Chinese. And the Chinese have been very astute about seizing those leadership opportunities. And so I think the Europeans have sort of stood back and said, the foundation of our post-World War II world is being shaken. And so when you think about a next administration, when Joe Biden is talking, he is trying to send a message that he embraces that multilateral system that had been at the foundation of US-European cooperation. So there's a rhetorical and a stylistic piece of this, but then you have to also look at whether we share interests. And here, if China is what the United States is defining in the 21st century as a major challenge geopolitically and geoeconomically, then you come to Constantine's presentation, which is, are there opportunities going forward for the US and Europe to, if not have a common policy on China, coordinate their policy effectively on China? And I think the point Constantine made is a really important one, which is that as Europe looks at China there now, they're not just thinking about China as an export destination for them. They have seen China go west. And I think a key piece of the Belt and Road Initiative that Constantine mentioned is China has very thoughtfully been buying up strategic infrastructure in Europe. And I would argue that European attitudes toward China have changed more fundamentally over the past year and a half than they have over the past decade. So you see a change on the American side of a bipartisan consensus that what we used to believe, which is if China economically liberalizes, that will lead to political liberalization. Hard to find in America and on either side of the aisle who will make that case today. So there's a sense on the US side that we have to hold China's feet to the fire on agreements they've made. Okay, if they're in the World Trade Organization, they have to then live by those rules. And on the European side, you see a deep concern about China's role within Europe. So I think there's a real opportunity there, both in terms of a worldview, but also a very clear assessment of interests, and then a foundation of shared values that could allow for US and European cooperation on this particular and key challenge of China.
Ivana, you wanted to jump in on something, if you'd like to right now, and then I'll turn to Constantine when we sort of drill into some questions.
Yes, thank you very much, Damir. So I would like to add something to Karen's thought on Europe and how actually the EU approaches the United Nations in a very, very idealistic way. And the EU itself also expects from the United States to take a lead. But let me give you one more example. Only last week, what happened before the United Nations Security Council is unacceptable for the future world order. So, for instance, all leaders from the European Union absolutely remained silent during the whole process of the election period, when both China, Uzbekistan, Pakistan, and Russia were all elected last week. So it's not only that the United States is remaining silent, it's also that the European Union's leaders are also remaining silent of what's happening within the UN system. And not only that, for example, if you take a look at the record of how different countries with the European Union are voting, you'll be very, very surprised, maybe not, to actually see how many times Greece supported China's resolutions. So I would like to say that this is the crisis of multilateralism. It's not only because of America First approach, but it's also because European leaders do not have maybe political will to take certain steps. Instead, they remain silent.
So I think this is a really nice segue. I just want to drill into two areas now, and hopefully we'll have some questions from the audience as well. Constantine, maybe you could kick this off, specifically on NATO, and the issue right now strikes me one of the unresolved and really not terribly well addressed by the Trump administration problems is the question of Turkey. You're seeing the European Union itself torn on how to approach Turkey's recent actions in the Mediterranean, and then, you know, even as an added issue, the West has been completely absent on what's happening between Armenia and Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh right now. So maybe you could use this as an excuse to talk about a little bit about the role of leadership, and again, how should the West, whoever is in charge now, or the United States that is, reassert some sort of direction on this question?
Well, a couple of points. I think that in NATO we have a couple of problems. The first is the problem with burden sharing, and I think this is a problem that has come up under successive U.S. administrations, and I think America has a point on that. And to be fair to the Trump administration, they do have a point when it comes to burden sharing. I think the Europeans should increase their defense expenditures. I think most of them have done so. I think this is an issue that is being addressed by the Europeans. But it is fair. It's a fair point that is being raised by on the other side of the Atlantic. I mean, we Europeans have been free riders for a long period of time. This is true, for all the historical reasons that we can talk about. So this is an issue I think that is of importance, because when I talk about strategic complementarity, this is what I'm talking about: an increased European participation in objectives, missions, and defense expenditures, so the Europeans should carry more of the burden while the United States will partially shift its focus to Asia and so on and so on. Now, the issue with Turkey, I think, is we have to recalibrate our relationship with Turkey as the West, in the sense that the paradigm that we operated under for a long period of time, it doesn't work anymore. In the sense that during the Cold War, we had a Western Kemalist secular Turkey. After the Cold War, we had the Turkey that initially wanted to join the transatlantic institutions, and by that I mean the European Union. It was always a member of NATO. But we saw that incrementally Turkey started distancing itself from the West, both in terms of rhetoric, but also in terms of policies. And especially now, because I do think that the Turkish leadership reads the world system in the sense that we are entering a phase of a transition to a policy-centric international system. And I think that the current Turkish leadership sees an opportunity to rise to the level of a major power. So this is a challenge for the West, and I think it needs to address the new reality with Turkey. My response to that would be that we need to engage Turkey. We need to try to maintain Turkey in a Western orbit for all the reasons that we understand. Turkey is geopolitically important. It's a geopolitical hinge in three regional subsystems. It's a big country. We need a democratic Turkey. We need a Turkey that is orbited around the West. There are carrot and stick approaches that we need to try collectively in the West, both in terms of European policies as the European Union and the American States. That's the one. The second, we go back to leadership again. Karen mentioned that, and Ivana talked about multilateralism. And there are so many developments that point out to the need for cooperation rather than a return to our nationalist borders. I mean, the pandemic is not going to go away. Since 1985, this is the fifth pandemic. We had AIDS, SARS, Ebola, H1N1. This, the continuing, the way that we have made our lives, pandemics are here to stay. They are the new normal. So there will be, although initially there was the nationalization of our response to the pandemic, we all understand that the future will require increasing cooperation, especially between the two sides of the Atlantic. But it's not only the pandemic, climate change. It is, migration movements, terrorism, all these new challenges, they are global challenges, and they require cooperation. And I think this is, enlightened leadership is what needed to pave the way for increased cooperation, especially with Europe, because the common, the transatlantic partnership was built upon a foundation of common values, common interests, and common threats. And I do believe that both are here today. We still have the same values, we still have common interests, and we still face a number of common threats. So I do think that all these things require strong leadership from both sides of the Atlantic to maintain the links between America and Europe.
Ivana, let me ask you this. We have a couple of questions from the audience, and I do want to get to those, but let me ask you specifically on this. It's the Belgrade Security Forum. Let's talk a little bit about the Western Balkans as well, and the the role of a future administration. Again, to me, the disjoint between a belief in multilateral institutions and the problem of leadership was demonstrated wonderfully here in this region under the Clinton administration, and it was a learning process for the Clintons to realize that disjunct between American leadership and working with Europeans on solutions. Trump administration has been criticized for some of its moves in the Western Balkans for alienating the Europeans. Again, can you talk a little bit your thoughts about again how a Biden administration might square that, the question of working with partners versus American leadership in getting things going? So if you could address that, that would be terrific.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a really, really hard question because whoever wins the elections in November, I think that person will face first and foremost numerous domestic problems. So even though the Balkans has not been on the US agenda for the past 20 years, as you just mentioned, the Trump administration has paid more attention to the region than the previous administration. And although Richard Grenell said that the Balkans is one of the main US priorities, I think the statement is purely rhetorical because the US has greater priorities than the Balkans. However, there are numerous challenges in the Balkans that either the Trump administration or the Biden administration cannot afford to ignore, specifically the rise of China, but also Russian influence, and I will talk more about that. So actually, it's a really good idea maybe to take a look at the most recent Serbia-Kosovo deal. So what I also has been saying in the past is that this was one of the Trump's tactics to advance his foreign policy agenda to boost his electorate before November. But also, with if you take a look at the agreement to open his idea to open the embassy in Jerusalem, I think that Trump's main international policy concern is China. And if you read the text of the agreement, for example, the deal forces both Belgrade and Pristina to forego using China's 5G network. So given China's push to install 5G networks, I think it will create certain challenges for Serbia and China. It also asked for the energy diversification, but I think this will be challenging to accomplish. So let me give you an overview of how I see that either administration can approach this subject. So Trump has been silent on all Russian activities in Belarus and Ukraine, so let alone, Russian influence in the Balkans. So I don't see any move that the Trump administration will take to halt Russian influence over there. So in theory, for example, the Biden administration might use the Balkans to halt China's and Russia's authoritarian influence, and maybe even to finalize a deal between Kosovo and Serbia. But I think in practice, on Russia, Biden promises to talk tough. Biden promises to talk tough, but he does not, for example, even suggest that he will impose more sanctions than the Trump administration. So whether he will care more than the Trump administration when it comes to Russian influence is yet to be seen. On China, I think Biden has similar policy to Trump, so he might take certain activities in the region to halt further China's influences over there. But one thing is certain, I think if for the Biden administration, as you just mentioned, the Democratic Party had a very, very different rhetoric than the Republican Party for the Balkans. And one thing that we need to really understand is that the diplomacy of the 90s is over. So now with China and Russia, I think countries in the region, they have different bargaining chips to improve their negotiation power. So if he wins, I hope that he will make more commitment to the region than the Obama administration. But what I also think is that he will give the Balkans back to the hands of the EU to manage relations over there. And oftentimes what I hear among people is that everyone is concerned in the Balkans about a democratic crisis. So a second term Trump administration, I think it will be much like the first one, and he will not try to project any systemic notions on democracy promotion. But also what we have to also understand is that the EU is, if you read their foreign policy security strategy, is also based on pragmatic realism, what it calls. So a genuine promotion of the rule of law among the EU in the Balkans will be questionable. So I think that unfortunately, it's less likely to expect that the US will promote more democracy in the region. But one thing is for certain, is that all countries in the Balkans, it is really, really time for them to cooperate more and to rely on their alliances within the region than to rely on the US or the European Union itself.
So we have another 10 minutes left. I'd extend the Balkans questions to either you, Karen, or Constantine, but let me just also throw in two questions we have from the audience, and then let's do a lightning round, Karen, Constantine, and then Ivana, and we'll close it out. So the two questions we have from the audience, one is, Karen, this is perhaps, you can definitely field this one, is how should our allies and friends think about the reliability of the United States going forward, given all the divisions that have come up, the internal divisions? You see Donald Trump perhaps even hinting that he may contest the elections. What does this mean for a consistent American foreign policy going forward? How reliable an ally is America? And then, Constantine, you had mentioned it as well in passing, but there's just a question, because I think COVID is on everyone's mind. If there's any thoughts about, future leadership coming out of the United States for COVID, and what kind of different world we might find ourselves in with stronger U.S. leadership on this globally. And again, keeping open the Balkans question, because this is the Belgrade Security Conference, if you guys want. Karen, please.
I just want to make one point about the Balkans, and folks may or may not be aware, GMF has an office in Belgrade. And I have a set of colleagues there who run something called the Balkan Trust for Democracy. And they are making grants to strengthen civil society across the Balkans. And of course, as we know, democracy isn't just about free and fair elections, it's about citizens holding government accountable. And I just applaud their work. But I also wanted to make the point that the longstanding and primary funder of that work has been the US government through the US Agency for International Development. So we don't often think of that aspect of US policy in the Balkans, but I do want to make sure that everyone understands that in that context, there's been a longstanding, continuing, and in the wake of COVID-19, growing US commitment through USAID to the region. To the second point and the question that you raised about US reliability, it's an understandable question. And I think particularly, we had a little conversation about NATO earlier, the fact that President Trump was a bit slow to reaffirm the US commitment to Article 5 in a NATO context, and many of the other things that he said have led to many Europeans questioning whether they can still trust the United States. And I was struck before when Constantine was talking about how alliance is based on shared interests and common values and the same perceived challenges. I also think alliance is based on trust. And as we all know, it is hard to build trust and it's very easy to destroy it. So I think that's really at the heart of this question. Can we Europeans really trust you Americans? And I would say I've been struck over the past 4 years at the clear bipartisan consensus that we've seen on Capitol Hill in terms of many of these issues with regard to Europe. And NATO would be Exhibit A, where you've seen overwhelming majorities in both houses express their support for that alliance. And that suggests to me that there is a reservoir of opinion in the US of Americans who believe that we as the United States are stronger when we're working together with our allies, starting with Europe. So I would say stay tuned. And I do think that there is an underlying basis for Europeans to continue to see that reservoir of reliability here in the US.
Constantine, any thoughts?
Yeah, I want to go back to the handling of the pandemic, because I think that this was another issue area that the confidence on the part of the Europeans on American leadership was, particularly damaged there. And I think not that the Europeans followed the multilateral policy in the initial stages of the crisis. I mean, the Europeans also reverted to national policies. I mean, they banned face shields, gloves, masks, the protective garments, and the export of all these equipment that they felt that they needed to deal with the pandemic. But I think that they were also particularly concerned to see Trump, for example, withdrawing from the World Health Organization in the middle of a pandemic. And that was another instance of leadership that sapped their confidence on the Trump administration. And I think that the crisis is still ahead of us. I mean, we have seen the first phase of the crisis, but we are now entering the second phase of the crisis. So I do think that it is imperative that the two sides sit together and design a strategy that will define protocols for mitigating the pandemic, will define common policies, and then in the long run will decide the common strategy for the reform of the World Health Organization. There's no question about it that the World Health Organization needs to go through a process of reform. That's one thing, but it's totally a different thing to withdraw in the middle of the pandemic from such an organization. So I do think that the pandemic is ahead of us. I do think that a change in the administration with the Biden administration that has given us reason to hope that there will be more trust placed on scientists and science and protocols and so on and so forth, and discussion with the allies. I think that there is reason to hope that we can face the second wave of the pandemic much more effectively, efficiently, and cooperatively. And so I do think that the change of administration in this particular issue will have a much more positive result in facing the pandemic.
Thanks, you, Constantine. Ivana, any final thoughts on any of these questions about specifically, the reliability issue? I think is also, but also the pandemic.
I don't have any thoughts on that because I already mentioned that in one of my previous. So.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, everyone. This really has been a very rich discussion, and I thank you for everyone for joining us abroad out in internet land to watch this. I think it's no exaggeration to say that this is a crucial election, a pivotal election in world history, let's say, and a lot rides on it. It's a complicated world that's changing, and we shouldn't at the same time overstate the extent to which it's just a question of changing leadership. The challenges are immense, and cooperation and making things work will not be a simple thing. But I at least am hopeful that we are approaching a troubled and difficult future with the right side of ideas going forward. I think transatlantic relations, alliances, it's the only way forward. In any case, thank you very much. Thank you to the Belgrade Securities Forum, and see you hopefully next year in person. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for watching the online panel of the 10th Belgrade Security Forum. We will be back soon.